Hello, and welcome to this 11th episode of the Global Crisis, Global Risk, and Global Consequences webinar of the GCSP, the Geneva Center for Security Policy. The GCSP is an international non-profit foundation physically based in Geneva, Switzerland, and comprised of 53 states, including all the permanent members of the Security Council. My name is Jean-Marc Frickley. I'm the head of Global Risk and Resilience at GCSP. The GCSP mission is to promote peace and international security, prepare and transform individuals and organizations so they can create a safer world, and the values we are supporting are impartiality, independence, and inclusivity. We reach our objective through executive education, research, public discussion, as well as an innovative fellowship program for executive in transition. Our community comprises more than 8,200 influential alumni in 165 nations. When we started this webinar series 11 weeks ago, coronavirus was approaching 1 million infections, and there were almost 48,000 people that had passed away due to the COVID-19. This week, we have more than 7.3 million, almost 7.4 million infection worldwide, and more than 400,017 people have passed away, of which more than 100,000 in the United States. However, Latin America and the Americas in general have become the new center of the coronavirus. As of today, more than 70,000 people have passed away in Latin America, and more than 1 million people have been infected by the coronavirus. So today's topic is very topical because we'll look at the impact of the coronavirus on Latin America. And it's a great pleasure today to welcome my colleague, Dr. Siobhan Martin, Head of Advanced Course Development and also Director of the Leadership of International Security course, who will introduce the speaker and who basically helped and develop this webinar. Siobhan?
Thank you so much, Jean-Marc. I'm just going to show my slides. Can you see my screen? So thank you, Jean-Marc, and good afternoon, everyone. My introduction remarks will be brief as we have an excellent group of panelists this afternoon to whom we wish to give maximum time. So I'll just outline some recent changes as well as characteristics in Latin America to set the context for this webinar, and we'll end with introducing the speakers and the order of their interventions. So first of all, Latin America has seen a lot of changes in recent years, some of which include, if my screen allows, well, China, which has become a major trading partner. 19 Latin American and Caribbean countries have signed to the Belt and Road Initiative in the past 2 years. But also traditional partnerships with the United States have been shifting since the election of President Trump. The longest conflict in the region came to an end with the signing of the peace accord between the Colombian government and the FARC in November 2016. But we've also seen the reverse, or the come down, of the rise of Brazil, and the 2017 to 19 super cycle of elections was marked by anti-vote and a move towards populism as a result of frustration with persistent socio-economic inequalities and reducing trust levels in governments across the region. And in addition to these changes, we must also be aware of some specific development and security characteristics in Latin America. For example, it is home to some of the most densely populated cities in the globe. Sao Paulo and Mexico City are in the top 5. It's also one of the regions with the highest shares of informal economy. A reported 55% of employees in Latin America are informally employed. It is also at the epicenter of an estimated $650 billion a year global drug industry. In terms of armed groups and militias, a 2018 survey placed the Americas with the highest percentage of civilian-owned arms in the world, with Brazil and Mexico in the 6th and 7th place, respectively. And amongst human security challenges, according to ReliefWeb, Latin America has the highest rates of gender-based violence in the world, and 3 of the countries with very high rates, Brazil, Peru, and Mexico, are among those most affected by COVID. And we all know we have seen a worsening of domestic violence across the globe as a result of some of the lockdown and confinement policies. Now, on the pandemic itself, I've taken some rates from the Johns Hopkins tracker this morning. Jean-Marc spoke about Latin America as a whole. Here I have the rates for the 4 countries that are mainly affected from Latin America. And as you can see, Brazil, Peru, Chile, and Mexico alone, we have over 1.2 million infected, fatalities at over 60,000. There are also over 700,000 recovered, and Chile has quite high rates in particular. But as you can see, the majority of infections and fatalities are in Brazil, which currently has the highest infection rates across the globe. And so it's for this reason, as Jean-Marc mentioned, Latin America has become a new epicenter for the pandemic, according to the World Health Organization. So while the impact in Latin America has still to be fully comprehended, this context is indicative of the enormous challenge ahead. Current analyses are quite pessimistic, with an expected worst recession in 50 years, according to the IMF, that is expected also to exacerbate existing inequalities, corruption, violence, and crime. But despite the overwhelming challenges, the outlook is not only pessimistic. As in other regions, the pandemic is seen as a potential catalyst to finally make long-needed changes to ineffective government mechanisms. There is this idea to harness the crisis by being bold in developing new approaches, to redesign the social pact for stronger, more inclusive social protection and growth, and to develop effective policies for a more resilient approach to security. And so multiple futures are still possible, but understanding the impact of COVID is the first step in order to better respond to it. And on that note, this webinar is intended to provide an overview of the current economic and security impact of COVID-19 at the state, urban, and individual level in Latin America, as well as the expected future trajectory. And in doing so, it will include a discussion of approaches for mitigation and/or opportunities for change as relevant. And so we will begin with an overview of the economic situation with Dr. Alvaro Mendez. He is co-founder and co-director of the Global South Unit at the London School of Economics. He is an adjunct professor of the Institute for Global Public Policy at Fudan University, Shanghai, and GCSP Associate Fellow on Geopolitics and Economics, in particular the relationship with China and the US. He will be followed by Dr. Elisa Aracil, a former international banker with Morgan Stanley, and now professor with the Department of Economics at the Universidad Pontificia Comillas in Madrid, who will follow on economic development. We will then move to Mr. Antonio Sampaio, a research fellow in conflict, security, and development with the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, and formerly an editor at Global TV News in Rio de Janeiro, who will address informal economies and look at how urban militias are reacting to COVID. Ms. Monica Mendez Caballero, a global security analyst, will follow with insights into the impact of COVID at the individual level, looking at domestic violence in Mexico. And we will end the panel with Professor Selena Realuyo, a former international banker with Goldman Sachs, former US diplomat and counterterrorism official, now professor of practice at the William J. Perry Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies, the National Defense University in Washington, DC, who will focus on drugs trafficking and financial flows, also connecting the impact of COVID in Latin America with other regions as a result of the transnational nature of those issues. But we will now begin with Alvaro. The floor is yours for the next 8 to 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm in London, but I'm Latin American. So in many ways, I've been trying to avoid talking about the issue because of the personal nature that this implies, especially my family and my friends are in Colombia at the moment. So it's quite difficult sometimes to think about what's to come to the region. But it is a pleasure to be here. I'm at the London School of Economics, and I'm also very happy to announce that I've been teaching at GSESP for the last 4 years, I believe, and now I'm an associate fellow. Good to see some former students as well and colleagues in the panel. So I'm looking forward to share some of the things that I've been investigating on the issue of COVID-19. As you know, academics are being pushed in many ways to produce research on COVID-19, and the problem is that we're not staying in our lanes, and now we're being asked to produce issues and topics that we were not familiar with. So I try to be conservative in the things that I say. I will be focusing on issues of geopolitics, but I use the tools of established academics. And just to start with, I want to highlight a reading that I just recently did by a colleague of mine, ours, in the US, a very famous political scientist, Francis Fukuyama, which a lot of you know because he put forward an argument at the end of the Cold War called The End of History, which of course was very critical and the situation of the Soviet Union and the USA coming to an end. But he recently put forward 3 key fundamental factors that countries have to have in order to deal with pandemic responses effectively. And I found his argument very compelling. His first key factor is state capacity. And he argues that by that, a competent state apparatus, social trust, a government that trusts and listens to, that their citizens listen to, and finally, leadership, effective leaders. Of course, as you can see in the screen, most countries in the world lack of these 3 factors, all at the same time. Very few of them have had this capacity to deal with the crisis in an effective way. But in Latin America in particular, I would argue that a lot of the countries in the region, which I refer to as LAC, Latin America and the Caribbean, lack these 3 key factors. So it is not surprising that the response to COVID has not been ideal. And that has been important. The media has also played an important role here because they don't pay so much attention to Latin America, or for that matter to Africa, in terms of the issues that are happening there. And the pain caused by the COVID-19 pandemic in LAC is unfolding without media scrutiny and global attention that we've been paying to China, Europe, and the US. But the region has experienced some of the worst outbreaks of the pandemic in the world, and I fear, in my opinion, hopefully I'm not correct in this one, the worst is yet to come. As my colleagues previously stated, the World Health Organization has recently referred to the region as the new epicenter of the pandemic, specifically looking at the case of Brazil, and this is very, very important. Some of my colleagues already mentioned the latest estimates. They're produced by the Pan American Health Organization, which is the regional branch of the World Health Organization, which, by the way, Latin Americans have been always very good at putting organizations together. This is the first INGO in terms of health issues, founded way before the WHO. But we haven't been very good at being proactive in putting the things that we argue in practice. But according to them, the cumulative cases, of course, are into the millions, 1,413,010, with 69,455,000 deaths as of just today, June the 10th. I believe that the actual number is higher. Why? Because the reported figures are oftentimes coming from not having proper testing and the low levels of transparency of the countries reporting the numbers I don't trust. For instance, the case of Venezuela is a good example here. It's very important to highlight that, that the pandemic's impact is not homogeneous in all of these countries, and that each of the 33 countries of the region must be scrutinized to be able to see the individual impact of the crisis. As it was mentioned before, Brazil, it's one of the critical points of focus, with 38,406 deaths as of yesterday. And more importantly, perhaps, is the prediction that the experts are putting forward. They expect the crisis to go up to 125,000 deaths by early August 2020. That's pretty incredible. The Pan American Health Organization provides the numbers. They provide them as the Americas. I disaggregated the data to highlight the 33 countries here because the full picture doesn't really tell a good, accurate picture of the region. They include Puerto Rico, which is part of the US, and of course a number of islands, including the Falkland Islands, which is a British territory. But this highlights the fact that some of the countries are not doing very well. It also highlights some good examples, and you can read a recent piece that I put together as an interview for GCSP, which highlights some of the good practices as well. I think we have to identify them. And Uruguay, in my opinion, comes out as a very good example. Of course, compared size with Brazil, it's a very small country, but per capita, the response has been phenomenal. And the numbers highlight that important factor, which I think is important. Now, what I like to do is to talk about geopolitics. Latin America has always been affected by geopolitics between the different worlds. In the Cold War was the case between the USSR and the US. And of course, right now we are somewhere in between China and the US. When you look at my map behind me, you can actually see that China is not that far from the region, because we are in front of the Pacific. It's really far away, but the importance of China has increased massively. And just before I go forward, very quickly, a quick definition of geopolitics, because everyone likes to talk about geopolitics. It's a very sexy word to use, but very few people produce and put forward a definition. This one is a very good one, and it's the struggle of the control of geographical entities with an international and global dimension, and the use of such entities for the political advantage. And in Latin America, we have one of the very important geopolitical spots in the world, which is the Panama Canal, along with the Suez Canal and the Malacca Strait. Moving forward, geopolitics have always been affected, the politics of Latin America at various times in the history of the region, and COVID-19 is not any different. We witnessed a few weeks ago, I think 10 days ago, some geopolitical maneuvering when Iran sent an oil tanker to Venezuela to alleviate the massive food shortages that they had in Caracas, despite Washington making a tantrum of it, and they were not very happy. You have to remember both Venezuela and Iran are on the list of nations sanctioned by the US. Another small LAC country also made its soft power geopolitical mark in the crisis, using its long-standing doctor diplomacy. Cuba sent troops, medical brigades or medical troops, as they call them, to Italy and South Africa, which is also interesting. It's not just geopolitical coming to the region, but also the region also having agency. And that's an important element that sometimes is ignored from the analysis. And the case of the interesting developments that we have witnessed in the last few years, as Siobhan said, is China and Latin America in the region. Right now, it's very fashionable to talk about China and Latin America, and people are saying, oh, wow, China just disembarked in the region. This is not accurate. Actually, China has disembarked in the region for a long time. They actually been engaging with the region since the 1960s, when Cuba became the first country in the region to have established diplomatic ties with China. And this is an important factor that is important to highlight. And China has always had an important strategy that has worked quite nicely in the region from the very beginning. And it's friends make gifts and gifts make friends. And this has worked extremely well in the region so far. And of course, one of the other factors that has allowed China to be so influential in Latin America is the fact that China doesn't have any dirty laundry like the Europeans and the US in the region. And that's an important issue. The pandemic crisis provides a new opportunity for China to position itself on its own advantage by deploying its convincing soft power, diplomacy to produce not only sympathy, but more business opportunities in LAC with its new face mask diplomacy. But in my opinion, of course, I argue that the region will need more than masks. And Elisa is going to talk about the economics, and we're going to be in a very serious crisis. China rescued the region in 2008. The 2008 crisis didn't have such a massive impact in Latin America because the Chinese were buying commodities nonstop. I argue that in this occasion, and of course I'm not predicting the future, it is very unlikely that China will be in the position that they were in 2008, buying commodities as they were, because they will be dealing with some very serious internal domestic issues, and also some of the global production chains that will be shifting. And this will be a situation where the Latin Americans will not be able to benefit so much as they did from before. Just my last minute to highlight some of these geopolitical exchanges that have happened between Latin America and China. I mentioned before there are 33 countries in the region. 24 of those countries have diplomatic ties with Beijing. The last one to switch from Taiwan to the PRC was El Salvador in 2018. And it's interesting to note that by the time the US recognized diplomatically the PRC, 12 countries in Latin America have already done so. Out of those 24 countries, then there are other 9 countries who do not have diplomatic ties with the PRC and have ties with Taiwan instead. And this is interesting. Why? Because Taiwan only has 15 diplomatic partners at the moment. So 9 out of the 15 are from Latin America, which also brings the geopolitical flavor to the equation. And of course, as more recent issues have demonstrated, the BRI initiative, which seems really far from Latin America, already has 19 countries in the region endorsing the facility. We can talk about that a little bit later when the questions come up. And the issue of the AIB, of course, 2 countries in the region members of the AIB, that is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And of course, there are 6 countries who are pending completing their membership. And finally, that policy of China, which has been really successful also in Latin America, which is the policy of having the face of the president traveling to the region. After 6 years in office, President Xi Jinping has already visited 13 Latin American countries, which is more than President Obama and Trump combined in 11 years. And of course, Obama did most of the trips to Latin America. President Trump has only been there once when he was forced to go to the G20 summit in Buenos Aires in 2018. So this is a very interesting issue that will play in the next few months. And I'm sure we can come back with more questions and perhaps with more analysis on this. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alvaro. I know it's very challenging to fit everything into 10 minutes, but I very much appreciated your intervention. How you began with Francis Fukuyama, state capacity, social trust, and leadership. I think there are 3 valuable lessons across regions that very much spoke to me as well as you mentioned it. In relation to China and the US, it's interesting because on the one hand, like you say, China has a new opportunity, but on the other hand, COVID has created its own complexities for China itself. But it's clear that the impact of COVID and the trends we've seen so far, maybe it will even speed up the process a little bit because we are seeing a recession coming through, which I know that Elisa is going to speak about more in a few minutes. And it'll be interesting to see how, which powers Latin American countries turn to, because like you say, they're always affected by major power activities, and it's clear that some support is going to be needed, economically speaking, in moving beyond this crisis. And so it'll be interesting to see where that goes in terms of US and China. But I do know that Elisa has a lot more to say on this subject, particularly on the IMF's phrase, we're heading to the worst recession in 50 years. And so I look forward to hearing her commentary on that.
Okay, thanks. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Alvaro, for interesting insights on the political background in the region. I want also to take this opportunity to thank the Geneva Center for Security Policy for inviting me to join this webinar today. And as Siobhan was saying, the topic of my presentation is on the prospects for economic development in the region following the COVID crisis. The departing point would be the latest report by the IMF that forecast a contraction of 5.2% in the region during this year. And although this contraction might seem unprecedented, my view is that we shall focus not only on the reasons behind the contraction that I will cover, but also on the prospects for recovery in 2021. Therefore, the idea today is to focus on the main reasons behind the economic crisis for 2020, focusing on the supply side and demand side reasons. Then I will briefly discuss what has been done so far by governments in the region. And finally, I will cover the reasons why, in my opinion, these economic effects may prove transitory and temporary, and we may see a sharp recovery in 2021. So going to the transmission channels from the supply side, the most important point is related to commodity prices. As you all know, the region is heavily dependent on commodity exports. The fall in commodity prices is well known, specifically in the case of oil, and that will hurt so many economies in the region, particularly Venezuela, Ecuador, Mexico. They are all heavy exporters of oil products. But if we look to other commodities, actually the pattern is very similar. We've seen coal prices coming down by more than 50% this year, or copper, for example, is down more than 25% over the year, as you can see in the chart. And that can heavily negatively impact countries such as Chile, which is the world's largest exporter of copper, or Peru, which is the 5th largest exporter of copper in the world. So that's one point of concern, but within the supply side shocks, there are other concerns. One would be the disruptions in global value chains. This is particularly relevant for countries such as Mexico or Brazil. They rely on intermediate inputs or parts that are coming from China or the US to assemble final products. And obviously this has been suddenly stopped because of quarantines and mobility restrictions and so on. So that's an issue. And in addition to that, there's an increased likelihood of corporate defaults. Basically because most companies in the region are small and medium-sized enterprise, and therefore they are far more vulnerable to these external shocks. Now, having said that, the good news, because there are good news as well, the good news is that the banking system in the region is in good shape. Actually, it's nothing to do with what we saw back in the 2008 crisis. This time, if you look at levels of provisioning, non-performing loans, etc., the overall banking system and commercial banks are in good shape, which means that in this crisis, they are not going to be part of the problem, but part of the solution. And this can help in preventing some of these corporate defaults by increasing liquidity and funding support for these companies. So that's an interesting remark. Going to the transmission channels from the demand side, the most important aspect would be related to trade, international trade. The region heavily depends on trade, as you can see in the slide, and specifically on trade with the two main partners, which are the US and China, as Alvaro was discussing earlier. Therefore, the paralysis in international trade is widely affecting the region. But on top of that, there are other factors that can explain the shocks from the demand side. One would be the drop in remittances because of the slowdown or the stoppage in economic activity. And the other concern from the demand side would be tourism, which of course is set to fall aggressively over the year, and that has a strong implication for the Caribbean countries. Now, against this scenario, what has been done so far? What's the government's response to this crisis? Well, from the two major areas, which is the monetary policy and the fiscal policy, we've seen important responses already. On the monetary policy front, central banks are cutting interest rates aggressively, as you can see in the chart, and they are also providing support to commercial banks in order to make sure that there's liquidity and lending facilities in the system. On fiscal policy, we've seen important announcements by most of the countries in the region, important fiscal packages, including direct transfers, subsidies, etc. Now, the point is that some of these measures, or most of these measures, may be limited, and there are important implementation challenges. In the case of the monetary policy, the problem is that when you cut interest rates, that can pass through inflation and weaker currencies. And that's a very important issue. Actually, if you see the chart on my left-hand side, currencies in the region were already weakening before the crisis. And the more you reduce interest rate, the more the currency will weaken. So that may prove that the monetary policy is somehow limited and temporary. When we go to fiscal policy, actually there are two major drawbacks to fiscal policy. One would be the fact, as Siobhan was mentioning at the beginning, the fact that there's huge informality in the region. And this basically means that traditional fiscal packages may not be enough. You may not reach the most vulnerable people, and they may lag behind without social assistance. So they need to somehow redesign these fiscal packages, which has been done somehow in several countries. And then the second drawback, or the second limitation for fiscal policy, is related to the huge level of debt in the region, which is an old friend. It's not new, but both private debt and public debt is very important, as you can see in the chart. And this basically means that there's little scope for governments to increase government expenditure, because the debt to GDP ratios are big in most of the countries. So what can we expect for a post-COVID scenario, taking into account all these challenges? Well, in my opinion, as I was saying, as the crisis goes through and we see that the mobility restrictions are reduced and the quarantines are reduced, we can expect an increase in economic activity, obviously, no? And it is quite important to get the idea, or the important takeaway from my presentation, that, according to my opinion, is not the focus on how much the economy is going to contract during this year, but we should rather focus on how fast the economy is going to recover over the next year. And when you look at the recovery after different types of crises, we find an empirical evidence that after pandemics, the recoveries are much faster than after other types of crises. And that you can see in the right-hand chart, there's a comparison of different crises. One was 9/11, the huge crisis in 2008, and SARS. And the fastest recovery was just after SARS. So that's one good point. Then the other thing is that, as per my intervention and as per what Alvaro was saying earlier, it is clear that the fortune of Latin America is linked to the evolution of China and the US. And we've seen signs of recovery already in China. You can see it in my left-hand chart. There are different indicators of activity in China. They are all recovering, and that may mean, or may signal the fact that a plausible recovery in China and later on in the US can improve the two major shocks in Latin America. And the two major shocks, from all the different factors that I was mentioning, the two major shocks would be commodity prices and international trade. And the more China is recovering and the more the US is recovering, the better we will see this performance in terms of commodity prices and international trade. This is what I think, in my opinion, that may prove that all these effects that we're seeing over 2020 may prove transitory, temporary, and we will see a recovery on economic grounds for next year. On the social aspect, that's a different story, actually. From my perspective, not only from my perspective, and so many international organizations, what we see is that this crisis will exacerbate and will deepen the social unrest. We've seen mass protests well before the crisis in Chile and some other countries, and this will just deepen all this social unrest. We will see an increase in inequalities, unfortunately, due to school closures, social isolation, the fact that there's huge informality in the region, as I was saying earlier, and therefore so many individuals will be without any social protection. So there will be far more social inequalities, unfortunately. Which, from my perspective, is also an opportunity to look for major reforms over the medium to longer term that include an increase in social protection measures, to build better infrastructures, to enhance financial inclusion, which is key, crucial in the area, and also to push the transition towards a low carbon economy, which can be made by associating rescue packages towards the implementation of environmental measures, for instance. So that would be it. That would be my views. I'm happy to respond to as many questions as you may have, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. That was quite a dense contribution about the economic situation, which can look bleak this year, as you mentioned, contraction of 5.2% due to a drop in commodity prices, as well as remittances and other factors. And your point on the economic side is quite optimistic, that the recovery will probably be fast because of the nature of this crisis and because the strong dependence of Latin America on China and the United States. Maybe the more pessimistic perspective on the social aspect, where you highlighted that this economic crisis will probably have profound social implications of unrest and inequalities, and that could be also an opportunity for improving social reform and social protection. I would like, just before giving the mic to Antonio, just remind our viewers that if you have any question, you can raise your question in the Q&A tab, and in the end, we'll have 1 or 2 rounds of questions and we'll pick up your question. The next speaker, Antonio.
Thank you very much. I think Elisa's presentation has made it very clear the fiscal, financial, economic troubles at the wake of the coronavirus pandemic that affect the sort of argument that I'm going to put forward and expand upon in my presentation. So I'm going to shift gears to talk about the role of non-state actors in Latin America. I will talk more in depth about the case of Brazil and specifically Rio de Janeiro, because this is still a very situation that is still in flux, and most of the evidence I've looked at in recent weeks has been from Rio de Janeiro, but it illustrates the challenges that Latin America faces with the what I think is a weakened and a more problematic, less capable state and government capacity to respond to the socioeconomic challenges in view of a very strong and consolidated illicit and predatory forces of non-state armed groups in Latin America. So in March, many international media outlets picked up on the story of Brazilian criminal groups, especially drug trafficking factions in Rio de Janeiro, imposing social distancing measures in the territorial bases in favelas. And this is accurate, this is real. The criminal groups used simple local outlets like pamphlets and local community radio stations to announce curfews and threaten punishment if such measures were not taken seriously. And similar social assistance measures, if we can call it that, have been reported in Mexico by drug cartels and elsewhere as well, for instance, in South Africa, in the case of Cape Town. However, some of these initial reports may have created what I think is an overly simplistic impression of organized crime as stepping up to fill a governance vacuum by the state in marginalized urban areas. This may be the case sometimes and in some areas, but as the weeks went by, the picture has become a bit more complicated. Again, to briefly take us outside of Latin America, in South Africa, for instance, the distribution of food supplies to vulnerable families by gangs placed recipient families in difficult situations, because sometimes the gangs, with the social assistance, also requested or pressured families for aiding them in distributing drugs during the pandemic. Similarly, in Brazil, the drug gangs have indeed stepped up to a limited degree in making up for the lack of decisive political action by local and federal governments and leaders. in implementing social distancing. But at the same time, they contributed and they contribute obstacles to local communities in accessing public services through violence, recruitment of young men to crime, and threats to civil society. So these basic public services offered by non-state armed groups in slums are well known by local communities in Latin America. They do not, however, make criminal groups necessarily more popular than the state. Rather, both state and non-state actors compete in a sort of perverse game of multi-layered governance, which is the fragmentation of public service provision and rules by different local lords, local sources of authority, creating situations of permanent insecurity and instability for locals. And I think that trend tends to become even more intense in coming months and years. A painfully clear example of this multi-layered governance came in early April, when the health minister in Brazil, Luiz Henrique Mandetta, then health minister, in contradiction of his own boss, President Jair Bolsonaro's anti-quarantine stance, said that his team was talking to drug traffickers and militias in order to respond to the pandemic, since, quote, many times the state is absent and drug traffickers and militias rule, end quote. So his comment was very controversial, but they laid bare the real social and political impact of non-state armed governance in Brazilian favelas, the decline of state legitimacy and the consolidation of an alternative and predatory order by criminal and militia groups. Sometimes this alternative order will result in somewhat positive measures for locals, such as the stepping up of criminal gangs in Rio for imposing curfews and banning the opening of businesses and circulation of cars during certain hours. Another measure, for instance, that armed groups have taken to contribute to social distancing is the imposition and to the anti-pandemic sort of measures was the imposition of a price cap on sanitizing gel and cooking gas in view of rising demand and lower incomes. And yet another measure was some drug gangs prohibiting tourists from entering some of their gang-controlled favelas, since at the beginning of the virus was transmitted primarily by foreigners and people who had traveled abroad. However, the case of Rio also illustrates what I think is the most fundamental impact of organized crime and non-state groups during the pandemic: their resilience and ability to retain both illicit economic revenue and armed power through the pandemic, which I think at the end, when we come out of this, will be quite important to have in mind, since we will be facing a situation in which a weakened and less well-resourced state will hopefully have to contend with this still quite strong and powerful non-state actors. So to give you a few examples, a report by local O Globo newspaper has revealed in Rio that armed clashes involving either drug traffickers and militias have been going on in 20 areas of the metropolitan area of Rio. And these have included full-on gang wars for the control of some spaces during the quarantine or the social distancing period. One such territorial struggle in the slums of Dezoito and Sassu in Rio, in the western area of Rio, involved 2 drug gangs and 1 militia group at the same time, so 3 armed groups, showing that the ambition to control territory and establish predatory order has become widespread among groups of different orientations. Furthermore, these clashes were mostly concentrated in northern and western areas of Rio de Janeiro metropolitan area, and these are the same areas that have been hit hard by the coronavirus. And this is probably not a causal relationship. The presence of armed groups probably has not caused the worsening of the pandemic in such areas, but the fact that these areas have been consistently underserviced by the state and predated upon by armed groups have probably contributed to the lack of institutional capacity and health systems in these areas. Another clear example from Rio is the role of the so-called militias, which are armed groups formed by former or off-duty police officers or military personnel, originally as vigilantes to provide security in exchange for taxes that they extract from these low-income areas. The militia groups have a law and order discourse that is, by the way, similar in some ways to the one being voiced by Bolsonaro at the federal level, of providing order by the barrel of the gun and killing criminal suspects sometimes without trial. One of the main differences between militias and drug traffickers in Rio is the political economy of their movements. Militias mostly oppose to dealing in drugs and instead rely on extortion of local businesses, the so-called protection tax, and the provision of illicit services such as cooking gas, minibuses for public transportation, internet access, etc. So reports have been emerging in recent weeks of how militias have been forcing businesses in low-income areas to stay open in order to retain that extortion income. Their local power is so pervasive that they can interfere in the public hospitals, for instance, to speed up appointments or offer better equipment for those that contributed to the militias. They can also interfere in the company that offers burials. So in the city of Duque de Caxias, there's only one company that offers burials for the city. And this service has faced severe pressure recently in order to speed up or offer better prices for burials. The militias have interfered and helped those that are in the good books of the militias or pay them on the side. And by the way, the militias are stronger in the western and northern areas of Rio, which again are the same ones that have been hotspots for the COVID-19 in recent weeks. So this forcing of businesses to stay open for extortion purposes and interference in other areas of governance have perhaps, it's quite, I think, likely that it has contributed to the higher number of cases in those areas. And I don't want to make it seem like this is restricted to Rio. This is, I'm using several examples from Rio because it's where I've seen a lot of evidence erupting, but when we go outside of the city of Rio, we have also seen the lingering local power of criminal groups. In the northeastern city of Fortaleza, for instance, two gangs, the Red Command and the Guardians of the State, have been fighting for territory. And once again, we see in Fortaleza the criminal clashes coinciding with the area most affected by the pandemic in terms of incidents and deaths, an area known as Regional 1. This therefore points to the resilience of organized crime and armed groups, as well as the resilience of their local illicit economies in face of a weakened state. As I think will become clear in this discussion, informal workers, which comprise the bulk of the economy in many low-income neighborhoods in Brazil, are some of the most vulnerable to the economic impacts of the pandemic and lockdown measures. States will emerge of the pandemic with weaker fiscal outlooks and perhaps even more concerning, in some cases, politically weakened, with even more political polarization, reduced trust among many sectors of society on national leaders, and a tarnished relationship between national, regional, and local governments, which have adopted different interpretations of the responses to COVID and are emerging of the crisis with the relationships pretty damaged. So these rifts place state governments at much weaker position to respond to the profound governance and security crisis underlining non-state armed groups in cities. So in a way, in summary, the main, I think, impact of these non-state groups coming from the still quite early evidence that we are seeing, is actually how they have not changed, and they have been able to retain their illicit economies and their local power. And I think we are going to see the greatest impact, the greatest change in the weeks and months to come, because as I said, the local the state governments will, in contrast, emerge of this crisis with a weaker, weaker political and economic position, and the balance of power, I think, has begun to change, and in a way that worryingly favors organized crime.
Thank you very much, Antonio, for that very comprehensive overview of, it's interesting you say that, gangs are not changing their behavior, but they've been able to adapt more easily to the current crisis situation than the state institutions have. The provision of welfare, curfews, price caps, on gel and on cooking gas, speeding up appointments in hospitals. It's very clear that what's worrying is that the gangs seem to be able to provide concrete measures in a way that the government institutions cannot. And I think a very bleak outlook, but it's realistic. That what we expect to see is the weakened state even further having to contend, as you said, with even more powerful, even more legitimized, even more resilient gangs moving forward in providing the type of governance that's needed by the most vulnerable and those most impacted by the crisis. So thank you very much for that look at the urban level. Just to mention to those who are attendees, we will be taking questions after all the panelists have spoken, and Ashley, our Q&A moderator, will provide you with more information after that. Now we will move from the urban level to the individual level with Monica, who is going to take us through some of the latest trends on domestic violence and the impact of COVID in Mexico.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone, and good morning to all who are in the Americas. First of all, I want to thank you to GCSP, to Dr. Jean-Marc, and to Dr. Shibon for the opportunity to be in this webinar. And I will speak about the impact and challenges of COVID on domestic violence in Mexico and a path of opportunities. And regarding human security, COVID has impacted not only global, as we have been heard from the previous speakers, but also an individual level. And this is something that the UN has called a shadow pandemic. Worldwide cases of domestic violence are increasing, yet in many places it is not easily visible, since lack of register is the first of several challenges to properly address the problem. In the case of Latin America, it's relevant, and of Mexico, it's relevant to understand that COVID has amplified structural conditions and an overall much strained system in charge of providing security for their inhabitants. So here it is. You can see from this slide the key elements that I have identified of protection measures that enter into action once domestic violence occurs. And we can see that in orange, we can see those corresponding to the judiciary system. And of course, this process isn't linear, and it can have several entry points as the first four elements. For example, depending on the case, it can start with receiving healthcare within the health system, and from there, starting a judiciary complaint and requesting protection for a shelter. Or it can start through a call of emergency services and request then to shelter access. And in those cases, it can be also the case that no further judiciary complaint is made, and then the following steps in the judiciary system are not taken. And it depends very much on case-to-case basis. So what are the existing challenges previous to the pandemic within these elements? And that can be broadly summarized in 4 categories. The first one is about number of cases. Not all cases are reported to authorities. and full number of cases are not necessarily reflected in any of these elements. For example, if physical damage is not that bad, they might not even go to the health services, and no one is taking care and counting those cases. The second one, it's agencies involved. In Mexico at the state level, we have the first emergency call centers are dependent of the public security sector. The orange, as I mentioned, are dependent of the judiciary system, and the National Commission to Prevent and Eradicate the Violence Against Women, which is under the Ministry of Interior, is in charge of their shelters and a companionship for women. And of course, the health system is in charge of the healthcare. Therefore, here we face diversity of budget, diversity of quality in training of officers, diversity of facilities, and in general, diversity of general procedures. Why is it so? Because even when this system is like an umbrella provided for the federal government, the implementation is taken independently in every state of the 32 states which Mexico is comprised. And in this sense, we, for example, in February 2019, it was also a strength in the system when there was announced the suspension of subsidies for services for shelters who are providing support for women under violence. The third topic is registries, because according to each agency, the record of the information is based on their own systems. And in overall, the health system records are the most helpful because, as mentioned, not all cases start with a complaint, and here it can be identified what other cases are happening. And the fourth element is the access and relation with public. As it said, because there are different agencies implementing the programs, variations in procedures and trainings of officials are expected to vary greatly. And for instance, lack of trust of the judiciary, public prosecutors, law enforcement agencies, and regional authorities sometimes impede reliable report and prosecution acts of violence. To summarize, this is what was happening at the moment of the pandemic. And during COVID times, these challenges were added, the organization of function as emergency services while the pandemic started to grow in the region. Particularly in Mexico, the first COVID cases were presented by the end of February. And by March 24, it was imposed in national restrictions from March 24 until March 30. And official registers report data up to April 30. And here we can see, I don't know how I can advance. The slides. Someone knows how to do it? So while I am able to fix this,
maybe you can reduce to non-full screen and then choose a different slide and then.
I'm trying to, actually I'm receiving help. Yes, thank you. So this will, here we can see the data of domestic, of calls, of emergency calls. And in this case, what we see is that during March of this year, it was reported the higher case of calls and emergency services regarding violence, domestic violence. And then we saw a drop in April. Can we go next, please? And we see the same with emergency calls regarding specifically violence directly towards women. We see a peak in March and then a decrease in April. Next, please. And then regarding domestic violence complaints, we see the same trend. Increase in March and then a decrease during April. But then we see in the next one, please, the rate of homicides, of specifically female homicides. And we can see that here we are actually looking at increase of the tendency in April. So what could be the reason and the reason of the diminishing trend is that, to begin with, the confinement started on March 24. And since then, during the whole month of April, it was less access for women or for persons who were dealing with domestic violence to actually have access to report during this, under these kind of registries. And also, it's very important because according to the NGO X Justice for Women, during confinement, 84% of judiciary did not consider mechanisms to prevent violence against women as functioning services during confinement. And we can now stop the slides and sharing the screen. Thank you. And so we can see and also a discrepancy on measures taken by judiciary sector as virtual and in-person procedures or victim protection while judiciary procedures go on. So which were the prevention measures that were taken for the government during this period? And we see that on March 26, Ministry of Interior addressed the public calling for further connections within families during confinement. And on March 26, a campaign named Bread, Come to 10 and Display the White Flag of Peace started. And there were a lot of critiques regarding these campaigns because the lack of implementation mechanisms to develop new behaviors during moments of crisis and uncertainty. We already were looking at this kind of phenomena before COVID started, as it was mentioned, but then we also find this element to not be enough measures from the government to actually make an improvement of the situation. And what are the general challenges under the current threat? There is lack of adaptation to confinement with aggressors. There is, with the representation that I show in the first slide, we can see that there is a need of collaborative efforts among governmental agencies and NGOs, especially to develop specific procedures of service and now also to keep track of the cases. And I would like to finish also with adding not only that also registers are much more in need to be considered more fully and to include several registries in order to have a further fuller picture and to understand better the phenomena. But what I would like to say, and I'm taking here from building on what Elisa had mentioned, what the threat that we are facing here regarding increase of inequalities is that when regaining the full economy, there's much more need to build on further decrease of inequality, specifically in the gender-based issue, because when talking about peace and security agenda and building on work of women in international security, there is the acknowledge of the fact that gender is about power. And domestic violence as a non-military challenge affecting national and international security, touching economic development, demographic changes, human rights, and government issues, really requires gender parity in policy making to actually have passive conflict resolution to be made. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Monica, who actually was live from GCSP in Geneva, and Monica just completed her 9 months course, Liz, so congratulations to her. And well, she looked at domestic violence in Mexico as a case study, and she highlighted the specifics of the Mexican states with 32 different states, 4 different agencies, and then look at different indicators of violence. And basically the message that is that more could be done, and we should invest in reducing inequality, especially when it comes to gender-based inequality and violence against women. Without further ado, we'll move to Professor Selena Releo. And again, after Selena's presentation, we'll move to the Q&A. So if you have any question, please use the Q&A tab and we'll pick up your questions. Selena?
Sure. So greetings from the United States, where it's early morning, but more importantly, we're seeing that this global pandemic has more, it's impacting us at the individual level, as Monica had just explained, at the community level, and then more importantly, the national level. But here we are, a group of experts who focus on Latin America, who actually don't even live in Latin America for the moment, taking a look at its impact. So I want to thank Jean-Marc and also Siobhan for convening this amazing panel, and for GCSP for inviting me back to share my latest, more importantly, the focus on how the pandemic is actually impacting global illicit networks. So I'm going to be sharing a presentation with you that will actually add to what we're looking at. There we go. And more importantly, we've actually touched upon several of the aspects of the kind of multidimensional impact that COVID-19 has had. No country has been immune, but sadly we're seeing Latin America and the Caribbean really bearing the brunt right now as the new epicenter for COVID-19. So we've actually already addressed the public health, the economic prosperity issues, and the lack of growth. And more importantly, what we're looking at is what's going to happen next. I'm going to speak a little bit to what has been happening with the security forces, both military and police, in response to the pandemic on top of their traditional national security roles. And then more importantly, this question about democracy. Have the lockdowns created this pent-up reaction? And more importantly, how is it going to evolve when we start to have the lifting of all of these quarantines and lockdowns? We've actually seen, sadly, in the United States, due to the really terrible experience in Minneapolis, how people have literally escaped from quarantine and have totally disregarded any social distancing in the protests that we've seen in the last 2 weeks. But what we're taking a look at in this part of the panel is the globalization of illicit networks. We're going to focus on Latin America, but more importantly, how Latin America has contributed to global illicit trafficking, whether it's through drugs, human trafficking, arms, gold, and other illicit activities, but more importantly, how it's being impacted. And Alicia had already spoken about the global value chain and the global supply chains bearing the brunt of the response to COVID-19, which have been tremendous lockdowns and actual paralysis of global trade and then physical movement. So as you know, these illicit activities, whether it's drug trafficking, human trafficking, contraband, and corruption and financial crimes are actually not new. What's happened over the last 3 years is because of the factors of globalization, we've seen these activities multiply so that the magnitude, the velocity, the wealth, and unfortunately, in the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, the violence accompanying this illicit activities have been directly challenging the 4 basic missions of the nation state, which are to provide security, promote prosperity, establish some sense of society, a rule of law, and then more importantly, this issue of governance. So what's happening now is that each of these different illicit activities is directly affected by the pandemic and the political decisions in order to respond to COVID-19. The most impacted has been the actual stop in global trade and travel in the Americas. And we've seen actually the huge impact it's going to have. As Elisa mentioned, it's going to be about 19% contraction in global remittances to the region, and tremendous contraction in terms of tourism and the commodities market that directly affect every one of the 33 countries in the region. What we're seeing too, because of the closed borders, there's actually no movement, or very little movement in terms of migration, both legal as well as illegal. And what's happening now is that those who started as victims of human smuggling, where they pay for a fee to get from point A to point B, in the case of the United States, many Central Americans who are making their way to the United States, has actually stopped and trickled because there's actually no work in the United States. So you're actually having something which we did not anticipate, which is a reverse. You actually have Central Americans who, when the economy contracted so dramatically in the United States, particularly in either landscaping or more importantly, the support, the industries such as restaurants, they've actually tried to make their way back. So you actually have Guatemalans leaving the United States, going through Mexico, and being tested at the border of their home country for COVID-19, because they'd rather spend time and more importantly, quarantine with their families. What we're worried about now is as we have the easing of the restrictions on the economy, and the United States is quite poised well to recover quicker than the Latin American countries, we're expecting later on the year and next year a renewal of those waves of migration towards the United States from the South. By the way, it's not just Central Americans or Latin Americans. They're actually those who are also still trapped in this supply chain who come from different parts of the world. They're called extracontinentales, not from the continents. What we're seeing though, sadly, because there's no movement, it's also impeded a lot of law enforcement's ability to rescue victims of human traffickers. And we're very worried that those who are in this supply chain of human trafficking are going to be victimized. As Monica had mentioned, we don't know what's happening to them because they're basically incarcerated wherever their traffickers are holding them until there's a better time for them to move out. The other piece that's been very impacted is the movement of the Venezuelans. As you know, Venezuela is the largest humanitarian and refugee crisis that Latin America has experienced in history. And we've had, prior to the pandemic, over 5 million Venezuelans who had left. Several of them have been trying to go back as well. And as we had heard with Alvaro's presentation, Venezuela is like a black box. No one really knows what the statistics are of the number of people who've been infected or died of COVID. And it already had been experiencing a massive humanitarian, economic, and political crisis that's now just been compounded by the case of COVID-19. So what's been in the news a lot has been the impact on global drug trafficking because of COVID-19's lockdown and physical interruption of the supply chains. Elise had mentioned global value chains. This is the problem that a lot of the drug traffickers are having, the inability to access, in the case of processing cocaine, heroin, opioids, fentanyl, and methamphetamine, the precursor chemicals from China because of the paralysis of global trade. The other piece is to actually get the drugs to market. The closure of the US-Mexico border and US-Canada border has really impeded. What's so interesting is the Mexican drug cartels are actually now hoarding drugs because of this fear that they're not going to have supply chain for the future. What's interesting in terms of global consumption of drugs, we've actually seen a dramatic decrease of recreational use of these types of drugs. But unfortunately, here in the United States, we've seen many more cases of overdoses for those who are truly addicted as a health problem. And this is something that we're going to anticipate as well. There'll be actually more people because of the economic and the social stress they're experiencing through lockdown. We're anticipating much more substance abuse, not just drugs, but alcohol, and also sadly abuse in the home, which is what Monica's intervention had to do with. We expect this to actually restart as global trade, but they're changing in terms of what they're going to be focusing on. And that's the piece that Antonio referred to, how adaptable and resilient these criminal organizations are. And they're very agile in identifying new markets and new opportunities. The other piece, which I spent a lot of time at, is looking at how the money is moving. Because of the physical restrictions in terms of borders and travel, it's very difficult to execute trade-based money laundering because you just don't have the volume of goods and products moving that you can over and under invoice. The physical movement of bulk cash. We've actually had record seizures of cash in the United States because the drug traffickers can't physically move, they're hoarding it. And also because there's so much ability to see suspicious transactions or suspicious activities, you can actually identify why are those people out on the street after curfew. They're actually raising their profile of risk compared to in a normal functioning economy. And we've seen an explosion of activity on the internet and the use of cryptocurrencies, particularly during the pandemic. So what's happening now is we're actually observing how these criminal organizations are adapting in the age of COVID. You're moving from more global to local. We've actually seen, sadly, in the case of Mexico, still record numbers of homicide and violence, despite the lockdowns. Where they're actually, the little cartelitos are vying for control of their local areas of operation, and also a new opportunity to actually start trafficking in medical supplies, these fake remedies. I think it's 6 out of 10 pharmaceuticals that are being moved all around the world are deemed to be either they're illegally made or illicitly diverted from a regular source. So this is what they're doing. It's a different type of trading in illicit activities, whether it's masks or PPE or different piece. And because of the economic constraints, with people having less disposable income, we're seeing and anticipating more flow of counterfeit goods. As I mentioned earlier, as we've seen the increase of use of cryptocurrency, cybercrime and fraud has just exploded. And this is an area that every country and jurisdiction is grappling with to actually anticipate how do you detect, and then more importantly, how do you go after crimes in cyberspace that are very hard to follow, not just the money, but the people and the origin of where these cyber schemes are taking place. As was mentioned earlier in Antonio's, you're actually seeing more extortion, more kidnapping, very similar to moving from global to local crime. And sadly, it's actually been documented quite extensively in the Italian mafias, the 'Ndrangheta, are actually issuing loan sharks and very high interest loans, which are happening also in Latin America because small and medium business owners can't access the capital they need to maintain their normal activity, and they will be indebted forever to these groups. And was illustrated with the case of Rio de Janeiro, this idea of providing social services in the place of government is happening not just in Brazil, but throughout Central America and in Mexico. So what's happening right now, and it's been happening even before the pandemic, we were seeing a shift of transnational organized crime capitalizing on cyberspace. And the dark net, you can actually order, in the United States, you can order your fentanyl from the luxury of your house and couch and have it delivered to your post office box. And we're seeing much more fluidity and comfort of these criminals in dealing with cryptocurrencies, and then more importantly, contact each other through the dark net and the dark web. So as I mentioned before, and I think it was so well outlined by the Fukuyama quote about state capacity. Here on your left, you can see in Mexico, the Sinaloa cartel with boxes, they're called care packages that have food and medicine and hand sanitizer, and they're actually branded with the face of El Chapo Guzman. And then on the right is an example of the favelas, of how they were taking things into their own hands to basically raise the awareness for those who are less educated and don't have the same access about the importance of washing your hands. And this is this idea of actually taking the role of the traditional government and creating this idea of alternative governance. So what do we need to do when we're thinking of transnational organized crime? And more importantly, how these groups are adapting in the age of COVID-19. First, we have to think about expanding the role of military and security services within the law to support civilian authorities. They had their traditional roles. In certain countries, they are engaged in border security, natural disaster response, but even more so on countering transnational organized crime. On top of that, now they have even more requirements in terms of physically assisting in the COVID response. In the case of Mexico, for example, many of the Mexican uniformed services are also converting all of their hospitals to address the needs, as well as secure the supply chains for PPE. But it might be at the expense of their traditional security roles. As we enter an era of much stricter budgets and much more tightening budgets, this is a huge risk that could also end up empowering these criminal organizations. Second, we have to understand and monitor and study the way these groups are changing their behavior, whether it's anticipating it, and then more importantly, being able to resource the response in an adequate and a timely fashion. And this is particularly challenging in the cyber domain. Then the third piece is we really need to reinforce the presence of the state in these marginalized communities at risk. And I think Antonio's explanation of what's happening in Rio is just a great case study in what could happen. And then more importantly, we need to promote an interagency and international response because now national security has always included health security, but it's even more so front and center that we're seeing right now. And you actually take a look at the response to COVID in different aspects. And it's actually, if we think about it scientifically, in how to detect the disease, how to develop therapeutics, and then the third piece now, which is the race for the vaccine. We've actually seen in the health sector great collaboration between the public sector, the private sector, and the civic sector. So what I propose is that we actually have to think of this whole of nation approach, not just in the health response to the pandemic, but in the national security response, trying to mitigate how these transnational criminal organizations might capitalize on this new landscape of greater inequality, greater corruption, and new markets, and figure out how to nip them in the bud, working within our countries, but also cross-border, sharing best practices and lessons learned. And that's what I wanted to share today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Selena. I very much appreciate your insights, very valuable insights on the impact of COVID on illicit networks. And especially taking us through the concrete impacts and expectations as a result of COVID through renewal of waves of immigration, the interruption of the drug supply chain, and it's very interesting to see how you go into it so concretely in terms of inability to access even precursor chemicals from China, for example, elements that we might not necessarily think of, but also the same in similar way as what Antonio was mentioning about the agility of these non-state violent actors, very agile in identifying new markets and goods. Also, we can see the trends you highlighted from global to local crime, trafficking in medical supplies in new areas, loan sharks, provision of social services as part of identifying new ways in which they can make money. What I thought was very interesting in your presentation as well is reinforcing the role of the state. We very clearly saw from the earlier presenters, particularly from Antonio, the absence of the role of the state, or the reality whereby these actors seem to be more adaptable and more agile than governments in certain areas, and how there's very much need to reinforce the state in that respect. I did appreciate you finishing with a more optimistic note, looking at the health response in combining private, public, and civic cooperation, and to maybe harness that as an example for other areas moving forward in response to COVID. So thank you very much to all of our panelists. I believe we have enough time for a short round of Q&A, and I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Ashley.
Thank you very much, Siobhan, and to all the speakers. We've got a great selection of questions here, but we don't have time to get through all of them. However, we do have time for one question per speaker. If I could please start with Alvaro. Will LAC countries gravitate more towards countries who have been successful in keeping COVID-19 numbers low for rebuilding? You mentioned Taiwan. Does that make it more attractive despite BRI, Belt and Road Initiative commitments? Thank you.
The answer to the question is no, I don't think so. I think Latin American countries will respond to the best country offering the most. And in this case, it seems to be China, but in reality, it's not necessarily China. I think there is a need in the region to stop thinking about what can I get for the short term and what can I actually get for the long term, which is important. And I think that should be the focus for the region. The problem that you have here is that we're talking about 33 countries, and each of these countries have different agendas, different priorities, and therefore it's very difficult to actually have a regional response. We don't have that. We talk a lot about leadership in the region and cooperation, but we have seen that criminal organizations cooperate more in the region than actual governments. And now what we're witnessing is an introspective view. On top of that, decoupling of the US is not cooperating with the region. And now we can blame Donald Trump for this, but in reality, this goes back before Trump. And on the other hand, you see a China that is cooperating with the region, makes them very attractive. But I think the solution has to be found in the region, and realizing that we have to realize and wake up and smell the coffee that commodity-driven growth is not valuable, that we have to put the focus on finding a new way of putting our mark in the economy. And perhaps what is happening right now with the decoupling of China from the production chain may be new opportunities for the region. And we were talking about medical equipment. Costa Rica is a very good producer of medical equipment. Going back to producing things in Mexico, which was the case in 1994 after NAFTA was signed, but then was shifted to China because it became more attractive than other countries in the region. So there is a need to find a Latin American answer to this problem, and of course, with the help of other countries. Europe has to be included as well. Europe should be approached and should find ways also to cooperate with the region, because they find themselves in the middle somehow between China and the US.
Thank you very much for your answer. My next question is directed to Elisa. In closing, you noted that you expect a quick economic recovery based on what has happened in past pandemics. Can you please comment on the sensitivity of this projection to how quickly tourism can return to business as usual? Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the question. Actually, that's the 1 million question, which we all would like to know. The chart that I was showing earlier was based on the experience on SARS epidemic. And based on that, the activity in terms of tourism actually went back to near normality in 5 months after the episode. So who knows if we can actually translate a past experience such as SARS to what's going on in terms of COVID, but that could be a good benchmark. In addition to that, I'll say that it's crucial the performance in China and in the US, which is what we are all suggesting in this panel. And the debate within the economies and the different international organizations is whether the recovery is going to be V-shaped, or it's going to be a Nike logo shape or whatever, but it seems that there's a convergence on the fact that there's going to be a quick and sharp recovery, much more quicker than after the 2008 crisis, for example. And let's hope that's the case, of course.
Thank you very much. My next question is directed to Antonio. Is there active coordination between the state, humanitarian organizations, and non-state armed groups in Brazil? If so, what do you think the consequences will be going forward in terms of legitimacy and governance? Thank you.
So humanitarian organizations have had a limited role and footprint in Brazil. For instance, the International Committee of the Red Cross has a Latin American presence and has had some projects in Brazil, including in favelas in Rio and other cities. But it is not a very large presence, and there are also some political sensitivities in the sense that some governments in the region don't like being seen to have humanitarian organizations working there, despite the fact that they don't have active armed conflict. So the question, the equation there really between non-state actors, I'm not only talking about gangs and armed actors, but non-state actors, including legitimate civil society organizations and the state. I think in the case of Brazil, there is most definitely a weakening of state legitimacy when we're talking about the national government, because there has been a really mixed messages, to say the least, in the way that the President Jair Bolsonaro has handled the crisis, with initially his health minister, whom I cited in my presentation, Luiz Henrique Mandetta, defending very strongly social distancing measures, quarantine, etc., and Bolsonaro sending a very different signal of skepticism and defiance of the scientific evidence on coronavirus, and even now sort of forcing or pressuring his ministers and local and regional governments to open up the economy. So there is, as I briefly mentioned in my presentation, this rift, this conflict between local and regional governments that are taking the pandemic more seriously than the federal government. That is something that has been tarnished, and there is also another element of how some civil society organizations. So one thing that I regret not having emphasized more in my presentation is a slightly more positive note of of what's happening in marginalized areas, which is the way that some civil society organizations, NGOs, local groups have taken up some of the response to the coronavirus. And that's why we haven't seen a greater crisis in Brazilian slums, especially in Rio, with the coronavirus, because food distribution, information, provision of information, etc., has been taken up to some extent by legitimate local civil society organizations and NGOs. So there's definitely a weakening of the government that is completely clear.
Thank you very much. And my next question is directed to Monica. What are your thoughts about specific repercussions on the continuous federal government cuts in the budget, and that it is directed towards infrastructure rather than public health or security? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. This is really important one, because what the pandemic now is showing to us is further localization to tackle the situation better and with more timely. And we have seen in the case of Mexico, for example, that there were more organized responses from some states, as Nuevo León and Michoacán, who established mandatory lockdown before the federal government did. And it is moment also for the states to reassume their amount of responsibility towards public security. As it has displayed in the system that I show, the judiciary system and the call centers and the agencies in charge of develop the shelters are mostly implemented by the state government. So it's not only a case of the federal government who has the whole responsibility. Of course, it's very important, and it's important to take a look on those cuts in the federal budget, but there is also a moment for the states to reassume their responsibility, and most of all for the whole country to develop a tradition of whole of society and whole of government approach. As also this system have showed, there is no single agency or single sector of society able to deal with the problem by themselves. We need more than ever, as Selena was mentioning, this whole of government and whole of society approach. And as Mexico have seen before in other crises, like in 1985, when these crises are faced, the whole society is able to rebuild a better system for the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica, for your answer. And the final question is directed to Selena. You showed an example of the assistance that has been brought by cartels. Could that be seen as kind of playing towards hearts and minds of people in a psychological way of gathering support? And do you see official governments employing counter tactics to that, perhaps? Thank you.
That's part of a different piece in terms of, we talk about winning the hearts and minds. And this is a topic that we've used in countering violent extremism in counterterrorism circles, as well as protecting youth at risk, who are the ones that are usually recruited by gangs and cartels. So what we're seeing is, unfortunately, governments have not really devoted the resources or the effort. We have been very bad over the last 20 years of fighting, particularly in the case of global terrorism, the narrative in that space. And we've actually seen in the case of Latin America and transnational organized crime groups, is they actually use social media much more effectively to actually advertise their ability to basically move your relative from Guatemala or El Salvador or Honduras to the United States. And they try to curry favor. And this is what we're seeing with those care boxes that we're seeing in Mexico. The other piece too is when we take a look at disinformation campaign and fake news, which is such, it's used every day, we're actually seeing this at a much broader macro level. And Latin America, again, has become a focus of geopolitics as we start our lecture this afternoon, taking a look at how external actors, which include the United States, China, Russia, Iran, are taking a look at Latin America and creating this disinformation campaign. So as many of you know, I work for the United States government, and we're really looking at how our adversaries are trying to push this campaign that the United States has become totally isolationist as a product of COVID-19. But we've actually taken a look at the statistics. As of last month, the US continues to be the #1 donor of foreign assistance, particularly in pandemic response. In terms of ventilators, we've just sent 1,000 ventilators to Brazil, as well as I think it's 400 was the latest tranche that was delivered to Mexico. But that word, that campaign, and more importantly, the image is not out there. So we have to get better about public messaging, not just educating the population of what's true and not true about the virus, but also who is trying to manipulate the virus with their agendas, whether they be positive ones or nefarious ones, which is the case particularly of the criminal groups. What you're going to see in the coming months, if not the next year, is, I think, a rebalancing of, even among the criminal groups, who's going to come out on top. And it might be the survival of the fittest or the largest, particularly in terms of the drug cartels who are consolidating their global supply chain and value chain and their domination of certain areas, and then taking advantage of the reopening of the global economy. But these are things that we need to always think about when we design strategies and policies and campaigns. That piece of messaging and strategic communications, unfortunately, is still very underestimated and underappreciated by leaders throughout the world, but particularly in the Americas. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Siobhan?
Thank you, Jean-Marc. I just wanted to say thank you so much to all of our panelists for taking part in this afternoon's webinar and for sharing your comprehensive insights, which I think were very helpful in enabling us to better understand the impact of COVID in Latin America and the next trajectory. We hope that despite the overwhelming challenges that were raised today, that the opportunity for change, which you also addressed, will be harnessed and lead to more resilience in moving forward. So thank you so much, and thank you also to our audience. Jean-Marc?
Yes, thank you. Thank you also on my side and GCSP for accepting our invitation, and thank you for Siobhan for putting this excellent panel together. That was very useful. So next week will be the last episode of this webinar series, and we will move across the Atlantic and then look at the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on Africa. And it will be on June 18 at 2 p.m. CET. More information on our website, and if you want to watch previous episodes, you can find all of them on our YouTube channel. And I advise you to sign up to the YouTube channel so you get the latest information about the center. Also to mention that Alvaro's piece interview has been published on the GCSP website. You can find it on our website, and it's a really good analysis. So until next week, stay tuned and stay safe. Thank you very much.